I want you to pause here for just a moment and imagine this. A single request, just 5 more minutes. Nothing more. No money, no favors, just a sliver of time. And in those 5 minutes, everything changes. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're cleaning a kitchen, folding laundry, or coming home from work, staring at the clock after a long day. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise, today's story will surprise you. This is the story of Maria Esperanza, a woman whose name means hope in Spanish, though hope seemed as distant as the stars above San Francisco's foggy skyline. At 53, Maria had learned that hope was not something you waited for. It was something you carried in your calloused hands, in your aching back, in the quiet dignity of showing up every day when the world preferred you invisible. She lived in a cramped studio apartment on Mission Street, where the morning air carried the perfume of fresh tortillas from the panaderia below and the distant clatter of the BART trains heading downtown. The walls were thin enough to hear her neighbor's television through the nights when sleep wouldn't come, but thick enough to muffle her own tears when she counted the bills spread across her kitchen table like fallen leaves. Maria's hands told stories her mouth never would. 27 years of scrubbing floors in San Francisco's wealthiest homes had carved deep lines into her palms, left permanent stains under her fingernails that no amount of lemon juice could erase. Her knees creaked when she climbed the steep hills of Pacific Heights, but she climbed them anyway, carrying cleaning supplies in a wheeled cart that had seen better decades. She had arrived in San Francisco from El Salvador 30 years ago, carrying nothing but a photograph of her mother and the stubborn belief that hard work could build something beautiful from nothing. Her English came slowly, learned from soap operas played on the radio while she worked, from the harsh corrections of employers who grew impatient when she mixed up past and present tense. But Maria learned, adapted, survived, the way water finds its way through the smallest cracks in stone. Her 2 children, now grown, had inherited her work ethic, but not her circumstances. Carlos worked as a mechanic in Oakland, his hands as stained with oil as hers were with bleach. Sophia had fought her way through community college to become a nurse, though she still sent money home when her mother's voice sounded too tired over the phone. Maria had sacrificed dreams she could barely remember to give them wings she would never have. The morning everything changed began like any other. Maria emerged from the Powell Street BART station at 6:30, her breath visible in the pre-dawn chill that clung to San Francisco even in summer. The 22 Fillmore bus wheezed to a stop, exhaling diesel fumes that mixed with the salt air blowing in from the bay. She climbed aboard, nodding to the familiar faces of other early morning workers, janitors, home health aides, restaurant prep cooks, all of them carrying the same invisible weight of necessity. Pacific Heights spread before them like an amphitheater of wealth, each mansion perched on its hill like a monument to success. Maria watched through the bus window as the city transformed from corner stores and laundromats to manicured gardens and wrought iron gates. This was a San Francisco most tourists never saw, where old money sat quietly behind walls of ivy and new tech fortunes glittered from floor-to-ceiling windows. The Brannigan estate rose from the corner of Jackson and Divisadero like a fortress of glass and stone, its modern lines softened by mature oak trees that had witnessed the city's transformation from gold rush boomtown to tech capital. Richard Brannigan had acquired the property 15 years ago when his software company went public, turning his brilliant algorithms into stock options worth more than small countries' GDP. The mansion was Eleanor's dream. She had spent 3 years working with architects to create something that felt both grand and welcoming. But Eleanor was gone now, and the house felt like a mausoleum. Maria had heard about the opening through Rosa, another housekeeper who cleaned for the Weatherbys down the street. Eleanor Brannigan had died 6 months ago, cancer, quick and vicious, and the family was struggling to maintain the careful ecosystem she had created. They needed someone experienced, someone who understood that wealthy families required discretion along with cleanliness. The wrought iron gate swung open silently as Maria approached, triggered by sensors that probably cost more than her monthly rent. The driveway curved through landscaped gardens where sprinkler systems hissed quietly, maintaining perfection with automated precision. Everything here was controlled, measured, efficient, except for the grief that leaked from the mansion's windows, like fog rolling in from the bay. Maria paused at the front door, her finger hovering over the doorbell. 30 years of domestic work had taught her to read houses the way sailors read weather patterns. This one felt heavy with unspoken things, with the kind of silence that follows shouting matches or precedes them. She straightened her shoulders, adjusted the strap of her supply bag, and pressed the brass button. The door was answered by a woman Maria's age, but where Maria's face showed the weathering of outdoor work and worry, this woman's skin had the preserved smoothness that came from expensive creams and minimal sun exposure. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a precise bun, and her gray uniform looked freshly pressed. "You must be Maria," the woman said, her tone suggesting this was not necessarily good news. "I'm Mrs. Morrison, the head of household staff. Please, come in." The foyer opened before Maria like a cathedral of wealth. The ceiling soared 3 stories high, crowned by a chandelier that probably cost more than most people's cars. Italian marble floors gleamed under carefully positioned spotlights, their surfaces so perfect that Maria instinctively worried about leaving footprints. Original oil paintings hung at precise intervals along the walls, not reproductions, but actual pieces that belonged in museums. "The family is particular about their privacy," Mrs. Morrison continued, leading Maria through hallways lined with more art than most galleries possessed. "Mrs. Brannigan's passing has been difficult for everyone. Mr. Brannigan especially values quiet and efficiency." They passed a living room where furniture probably worth more than Maria's annual income sat arranged in conversational groups no one seemed to use. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of San Francisco Bay that real estate agents would have called priceless, but the curtains were drawn tight, blocking out the morning light. "Your responsibilities will include the main living areas, the kitchen, and Mr. Brannigan's study," Mrs. Morrison explained. "The other staff will handle the bedrooms and personal spaces. We maintain schedules here. Everything happens at precise times. Breakfast service begins at 7, lunch at noon, dinner at 6:30. You'll work around these schedules." Maria nodded, taking mental notes while her eyes cataloged the scope of her new responsibilities. This wasn't just cleaning. This was maintaining a shrine to a life that no longer existed. They entered the kitchen, a chef's dream of marble counters and professional-grade appliances. Sub-Zero refrigerators hummed quietly next to wolf ranges that looked barely used. Copper pots hung from a ceiling rack like expensive jewelry, their surfaces gleaming with the kind of polish that suggested they served more decorative than practical purposes. "Mrs. Brannigan did most of the cooking herself," Mrs. Morrison said, and for the first time, her voice carried a note of genuine sadness. She insisted on it, said food was how she showed love. She walked to a window that looked out on the garden, where roses bloomed in careful rows. "Mr. Brannigan hasn't eaten a proper meal since. The weight of that statement hung in the air between them like incense in a church. Maria understood grief. She had lost her own mother 2 years ago, had watched the woman who raised her fade away in a hospital bed, surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed but couldn't hold her hand. But this grief was different, complicated by wealth that couldn't purchase healing and walls that trapped sorrow instead of protecting from it. A door opened somewhere in the house, followed by footsteps on marble. Mrs. Morrison straightened instinctively, her professional demeanor sliding into place like armor. "That will be Mr. Brannigan," she whispered. "Remember, efficient and invisible." But Maria had been invisible for 30 years. She knew how to disappear into wallpaper, how to clean around people as if she were made of air. What she was still learning, what this house would teach her, was how visible invisibility could become when someone finally chose to see. The footsteps grew closer, each one echoing through the mansion like a countdown to something inevitable. Maria smoothed her uniform, checked that her supplies were neatly arranged, and prepared to meet the man whose grief filled this house like fog rolling in from the Pacific. She didn't know yet that she was about to encounter someone whose brokenness would mirror her own, whose healing would become entangled with hers in ways neither of them could imagine. Richard Brannigan appeared in the kitchen doorway like a specter of his former self. Maria had seen his photograph in the society pages of the Chronicle, usually standing beside Eleanor at charity galas, both of them smiling with the practiced ease of people accustomed to being photographed. The man in those pictures had been robust, confident, wearing success like a well-tailored suit. This man looked hollowed out from the inside. He was tall, probably 6'2", but he carried himself as if his height were a burden. His dark hair, liberally streaked with silver, looked like he'd been running his hands through it. Designer clothes hung loosely on a frame that had clearly lost weight, and his eyes, pale blue like winter sky, held the kind of exhaustion that sleep couldn't cure. "Mrs. Morrison," he said, his voice carrying the rough edges of someone who'd spent too many nights talking to empty rooms. "This is our new—" He paused, seeming to search for the right word. "Our new help." The word stung, but Maria was used to being reduced to her function. In 30 years of domestic work, she'd been the help, the girl, even in her 50s, the cleaning lady, anything but her name. She'd learned not to expect more. "Maria Esperanza," Mrs. Morrison provided. "She comes highly recommended." Richard's gaze fell on Maria briefly, a cursory assessment that found her acceptable in the way one might approve of new kitchen equipment, functional, unremarkable, suitable for purpose. "Fine," he said, "just quiet." Eleanor always kept things quiet. He moved through the kitchen like he was navigating around invisible obstacles, opening the refrigerator and staring into its depths without seeming to see anything. After a long moment, he closed it without taking anything out and walked away, leaving behind only the echo of expensive shoes on marble and the lingering scent of aftershave that probably cost more than Maria's weekly groceries. "He's having a difficult time," Mrs. Morrison said quietly, though whether she was making excuses or simply stating facts wasn't clear. Mrs. Brannigan handled, well, everything. The household, the social calendar, the children's lives. "He's trying to learn, but—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Maria understood. Grief was a country with its own language, its own customs, and the wealthy grieved in mansions that echoed with emptiness, while the poor grieved in crowded apartments where life continued around them. Neither was easier, but they were different kinds of difficult. Maria spent her first day learning the geography of loss. The mansion had 23 rooms spread across 4 floors, each one perfectly appointed and rarely used. Eleanor's presence lingered everywhere, in the way books were arranged on shelves, in the careful placement of fresh flowers that no one seemed to notice anymore, in the subtle sense of lavender and vanilla that seemed to drift through the air like memories. The other staff moved around Maria with polite distance. Besides Mrs. Morrison, there was James, the butler, who had the kind of British accent that sounded authentic but probably wasn't. He treated Maria with the cool politeness reserved for temporary inconveniences. 2 other housekeepers, both younger women from Eastern Europe, spoke to each other in rapid whispers that stopped when Maria approached. It was clear that the household staff had formed its own ecosystem, with hierarchies and alliances that excluded newcomers. Maria was used to this too, the way immigrant women were often viewed with suspicion by those who'd been in America longer, the way age was seen as a liability in a field where physical stamina mattered. But she was also used to winning people over, slowly and quietly, through the simple act of showing up and doing good work. She started with the obvious things, dusting surfaces that already looked clean, organizing closets that Mrs. Morrison kept in perfect order, polishing silverware that gleamed from lack of use. But Maria's eye caught details others missed. She noticed that the orchids in the living room were overwatered, their roots showing signs of rot. She saw that the books in the library were arranged by height rather than subject, beautiful but impractical. She observed that the kitchen's large windows faced east, perfect for morning light, but the curtains were always drawn. By the end of her first day, Maria's back ached and her feet throbbed, but she'd begun to understand the house's rhythms. Richard disappeared into his study after breakfast and emerged sporadically throughout the day, always looking slightly lost. The children, grown adults with their own apartments in the city, called but rarely visited. Mrs. Morrison maintained routines as if Eleanor might return at any moment to inspect them. It was a house suspended in time, preserved like a museum exhibit of a life that no longer existed. Maria rode the bus home to the Mission District as the sun set over the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that no amount of wealth could purchase. The contrast between worlds struck her as it always did, from the sterile perfection of Pacific Heights to the vibrant chaos of her neighborhood, where children played in concrete courtyards and the smell of cooking food drifted from open windows. Her studio apartment welcomed her with its familiar cramped comfort. She heated leftover soup on a hot plate while sorting through the day's impressions. 30 years of domestic work had taught her to read families the way doctors read symptoms. The Brannigans were sick with something money couldn't cure, and she suspected that healing, if it came at all, would require more than perfect housekeeping. That night, as sirens wailed in the distance and her upstairs neighbor's television murmured through thin walls, Maria lay on her narrow bed and thought about the man in the expensive suit who couldn't find anything to eat in a kitchen full of food. She thought about the mansion full of beautiful things that no one seemed to see anymore, about the way grief could turn a home into a mausoleum. She'd taken this job for the money. The Brannigans paid well, better than most families she'd worked for. But already, she sensed that this would be different, not easier, certainly not simpler, but different in ways she couldn't yet name. Maria had always believed that houses had souls, and the Brannigan mansion's soul was in pain. Whether she could help heal it remained to be seen, but she knew she would try. It was what she did, what she'd always done. She showed up, worked hard, and hoped that somehow her simple presence might matter. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of her patience and resilience. But tonight, she said a prayer for the man who wandered through his own home like a ghost, for the household staff struggling to maintain routines that no longer served their purpose, and for herself, that she might find a way to bring some small measure of peace to a house that had forgotten what peace felt like. The fog rolled in from the bay, wrapping San Francisco in its nightly embrace, and Maria fell asleep to the sound of the city breathing around her, unaware that her quiet revolution had already begun. Maria's second week at the Brannigan estate felt like walking through a minefield where the explosives were made of silence and suppressed rage. She'd learned to navigate the household's unspoken tensions, the way certain rooms went unused, the way conversations stopped when Richard appeared. But understanding the dynamics didn't make them any less exhausting to live within. She had also learned that wealth didn't insulate families from cruelty. Sometimes, it just made the cruelty more refined. It began with small things. Her supply closet, which she'd organized with the methodical care of someone who'd spent decades making do with limited resources, would be mysteriously disrupted. Cleaning products moved to different shelves, her personal items, a small photo of her children, a rosary her mother had given her, relocated or turned face down. The first time it happened, Maria assumed she'd misremembered. The third time, she knew it was intentional. James, the butler, began finding fault with her work in ways that felt personal rather than professional. The marble floors weren't quite shiny enough, despite hours of polishing. The baseboards had microscopic dust particles that apparently required re-cleaning. The way she folded towels didn't meet household standards, though no one had ever explained what those standards were. But the worst came from Richard's children. Michael Brannigan was 28, a tech entrepreneur whose startup had been acquired by Google for an amount that the San Francisco Chronicle had described as substantial. He lived in a penthouse in Soma and drove a Tesla that probably cost more than most people's homes. When he visited his father, which he did sporadically and apparently under duress, he treated Maria like animated furniture. "The cleaning lady needs to be more careful with my mother's things," he told Mrs. Morrison one afternoon, loudly enough for Maria to hear from the next room where she was polishing silver picture frames. "Some of these pieces are irreplaceable." Maria paused in her work, her hand stilling on a photograph of Eleanor, laughing at what looked like a family barbecue. She'd been especially gentle with Eleanor's belongings, understanding instinctively that they were sacred objects now. But Michael's accusation felt less about her carefulness and more about establishing his territory. His sister Jessica was worse. 26, with her mother's delicate features and her father's pale eyes, she worked as a marketing director for a luxury hotel chain. Her Berkeley MBA had taught her sophisticated ways to express contempt that didn't quite cross into anything actionable. "I'm sure she's doing her best," Jessica would say when discussing Maria's work, the phrase delivered with the kind of smile that made it clear her best was presumed to be inadequate. Of course, Mother had very specific ways she liked things done. It's hard for someone from a different background to understand these subtleties. The different background was code, and they all knew it. Maria heard it in the way Jessica pronounced certain words, saw it in the way Michael's eyes slid past her as if she were invisible. She'd encountered this before, the casual racism of people who considered themselves too sophisticated for overt prejudice, but couldn't help revealing their assumptions through 1,000 small cuts. What hurt more than their disdain was Richard's silence in the face of it. He said nothing when Michael criticized her work, nothing when Jessica made her pointed comments about different backgrounds. His passivity felt like complicity, another small betrayal in a career full of them. But Maria had survived worse, and she understood something about wealthy families that they often didn't understand about themselves. Their cruelty usually came from pain, not malice. Michael and Jessica weren't attacking her personally. They were attacking the change she represented, the disruption of routines that kept their grief at bay. That didn't make it acceptable, but it made it bearable. The breaking point came on a Thursday morning in her 4th week. Maria arrived to find Mrs. Morrison waiting in the kitchen, her usual composed demeanor showing cracks around the edges. "There's been an incident," Mrs. Morrison said without preamble. "Mrs. Brannigan's jewelry box was found open yesterday. Some pieces appear to be missing." The words hit Maria like cold water. In 30 years of domestic work, she'd never been accused of theft, never given anyone reason to question her integrity. Her hands went automatically to the small gold cross she wore around her neck, her mother's last gift to her. "I haven't been in Mrs. Brannigan's bedroom," Maria said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "You said the bedrooms were off limits to me." "Yes, well, the family is understandably concerned. They've asked that your belongings be searched." The humiliation was swift and thorough. James went through her purse while Mrs. Morrison examined her supply cart. They found nothing, of course, because there was nothing to find. But the process itself was degrading in a way that no apology could undo. They were treating her like a criminal based on nothing but suspicion and stereotype. "I'm sorry," Mrs. Morrison said afterward, though she didn't sound sorry. "It's just procedure." But Maria knew it wasn't procedure. It was punishment, for being different, for being new, for representing change in a house that wanted to stay frozen in time. If she'd been white, if she'd been younger, if she'd spoken English without the trace of an accent, would they have searched her belongings? The answer sat between them like smoke from a snuffed candle. She continued working that day with mechanical precision, her pride wounded, but her dignity intact. She'd learned long ago that her character wasn't defined by other people's assumptions about her, but by her own actions. Still, the injustice burned like acid in her chest. That afternoon, while polishing the banister on the main staircase, she overheard Michael talking to his father in the study. "I think we need someone more established," he was saying. "Someone with references from families we know. This woman is fine for basic cleaning, but Mother's belongings require someone with more sensitivity to their value. She seems competent. Richard's voice was tired, discouraged. Mrs. Morrison says her work is adequate. Adequate isn't enough, not for this house, not for Mother's things. We need to maintain certain standards. Standards. The word had become a weapon, deployed whenever they wanted to exclude her without saying so directly. Maria understood that she was being discussed like a purchase that hadn't lived up to its warranty. But as she listened to Michael catalog her supposed inadequacies, something shifted inside her. 30 years of biting her tongue, of accepting disrespect for the sake of keeping jobs, of swallowing indignities because her children needed food and her rent needed paying. Suddenly, it felt like enough. That evening, as she prepared to leave for the day, Maria found herself alone in Eleanor's garden. The roses were blooming despite being largely neglected, pink and white blooms that released their fragrance into the cooling air. Eleanor had planted these herself, Mrs. Morrison had mentioned, spending hours on her knees in the soil despite having gardeners who could have done the work. Maria knelt beside the rosebed and began pulling weeds that had crept in around the base of the bushes. She didn't think about why she was doing it. It simply felt necessary. The garden had been Eleanor's joy, and it deserved better than abandonment. She was so absorbed in the work that she didn't hear footsteps on the gravel path behind her. "What are you doing?" Maria looked up to find Richard standing there, still in his business suit, but with his tie loosened and his jacket slung over one arm. His expression was unreadable, not angry, but not pleased either. "The weeds," Maria said simply, sitting back on her heels. "They're choking the roses." He stared at her for a long moment, then at the garden. "Eleanor spent hours out here," he said finally. "Every evening after dinner she'd come out here with her tools and work until it got too dark to see." "She did good work," Maria said, gesturing to the healthy blooms. "They remember her care." Something flickered across Richard's face, surprise maybe, or recognition. "You didn't have to do this. Garden maintenance isn't part of your duties." "No," Maria agreed, brushing dirt from her hands. "But sometimes we do things not because we have to, but because they need doing." She stood slowly, her knees protesting after the unaccustomed kneeling. Richard was still watching her with that unreadable expression, as if trying to solve a puzzle he hadn't known existed. "My son thinks I should let you go," he said abruptly. The words hung between them like a challenge. Maria met his eyes steadily, the way she'd learned to face every threat to her livelihood over the years. "Your son has never cleaned a house in his life," she said quietly. "He doesn't understand that taking care of things requires love, not just technique." It was the boldest thing she'd ever said to an employer, and for a moment she regretted it. But then she saw something shift in Richard's expression, not anger, but interest. "You think that's what this house needs? Love?" "This house has love," Maria said. "It's built into every room your wife touched, but love without attention dies, like plants without water." They stood there in the gathering dusk, surrounded by Eleanor's roses, and for the first time since Maria had started working there, the silence between them felt comfortable rather than charged. "5 more minutes," Richard said unexpectedly. "Sir?" Eleanor always asked for 5 more minutes in the garden, just 5 more minutes to finish what she was doing. He looked at the roses Maria had cleared of weeds, their blooms more visible now against the darkening sky. She said everything important could be accomplished in 5 minutes if you focused on what really mattered. Maria nodded, understanding that this was something precious he was sharing, a glimpse of the marriage that had been lost, the woman who had made this house a home. 5 more minutes, she agreed. The next morning, Maria arrived at work to find the missing jewelry on Mrs. Morrison's desk. Jessica had found it in her own apartment, apparently having borrowed it and forgotten to mention it. The apology was brief and impersonal, delivered without eye contact or genuine remorse. But Richard was there to hear it, and his expression as he listened to his daughter's explanation suggested that he understood exactly what had happened and why. "I believe we owe Maria an apology," he said quietly. "A genuine one." Jessica's face flushed pink, but she managed a stilted, "I'm sorry for the confusion. that satisfied no one but ended the immediate crisis. Later that day, as Maria worked in Eleanor's garden during her lunch break, Richard joined her. He didn't speak, just knelt beside her and began pulling weeds with inexperienced but determined hands. His expensive suit was entirely unsuited for garden work, but he didn't seem to care. They worked in comfortable silence, two people learning to tend something beautiful that someone else had created. And for the first time since Eleanor's death, the Brannigan estate felt like it might someday be a home again. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but it began in that garden, with dirt under their fingernails and the scent of roses in the air. Sometimes the most important changes start with 5 minutes of attention to things that everyone else assumes don't matter. Sometimes healing begins with weeding. 3 months into her employment, Maria had developed a routine that felt almost sustainable. She arrived each morning at 7:30, after the worst of the fog had burned off but before the household fully stirred to life. The 22 Fillmore bus had become her meditation chamber, 40 minutes of watching San Francisco wake up through windows that needed cleaning. She'd learned which days Richard emerged from his study looking human, and which days he looked like he'd been wrestling with ghosts. She'd memorized Mrs. Morrison's moods, James's subtle attempts to undermine her work, and the particular way the house felt on Sundays when no one visited, and grief settled into all the empty rooms like dust. But she'd also learned the house's secrets, the way morning light fell through the east windows if you opened the curtains, the perfect acoustics in the music room that no one used anymore, the hidden breakfast nook where Eleanor had apparently eaten toast and read the Chronicle every morning for 15 years. Maria had begun opening the curtains. It started small and tentative, just one set of drapes in the front hall to let in enough light to see the dust motes dancing in the air. When no one objected, she opened another set, then another. Slowly, the house began to breathe again, sunlight creeping into spaces that had been dark for months. She also began humming while she worked. She couldn't help herself. Silence made her anxious, and she'd grown up in a house where her mother sang Dominican merengue while cooking, where music was as essential as air. The tunes were simple things, lullabies her grandmother had sung, hymns from the Catholic church she attended in the mission, sometimes just wordless melodies that seemed to rise from her chest without conscious thought. The humming seemed to wake something in the house. One morning, she walked into the kitchen to find Richard standing by the window, listening. He didn't say anything when he saw her, just nodded slightly and poured himself coffee from the machine that Eleanor had apparently used to make him a perfect cup every morning for 23 years. She used to hum too, he said suddenly, while she cooked. Dominican songs sometimes. Her grandmother was from Santiago. Maria felt her heart skip. Eleanor had been Dominican, like her mother, like the women who'd raised her with music and strong coffee and the belief that love was best expressed through small daily acts of care. "You didn't know?" Richard asked, seeing her expression. "Mrs. Morrison said she was from Connecticut, old family." Richard's smile was the first genuine one Maria had seen from him. Eleanor let people think what they wanted to think. Her father was Dominican, her mother was from old Connecticut money. She grew up between two worlds, spoke perfect Spanish but never mentioned it in public, said it was easier that way. The revelation recontextualized everything Maria had observed about the house. The kitchen's design, with its large windows perfect for morning light, that was Dominican preference she recognized now. The way Eleanor had arranged the furniture in conversational groups, the emphasis on family photographs, the herb garden that included cilantro and sofrito ingredients. It all made sense now. "She would have liked you," Richard continued, almost as if speaking to himself. "Would have liked your singing. The house has been too quiet since—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Maria understood. Grief had silenced the music Eleanor had brought to this house, and now Maria's humming was calling it back like a ghost returning to familiar haunts. That afternoon, while cleaning Eleanor's study, a space Mrs. Morrison had finally granted her access to, Maria discovered a small wooden box tucked behind books on Dominican history and culture. Inside were treasures that told the story of a woman who'd lived between worlds, letters in Spanish from family in Santiago, photographs of a young Eleanor dancing at what looked like a village festival, a small ceramic figurine of a rooster, probably from a local artisan. At the bottom of the box was a recipe card stained with use and written in Eleanor's careful handwriting. Abuela's sancocho, como lo hacía mi bisabuela en Santiago. The familiar recipe for the hearty stew that was comfort food for every Dominican family Maria had ever known. That evening, instead of taking the bus straight home, Maria stopped at the Latin grocery store on Mission Street. She bought yuca, plantains, fresh cilantro, and the other ingredients for sancocho, working from memory and Eleanor's card. The owner of the store, an elderly man from El Salvador, smiled when he saw her purchases. "Making sancocho for someone special?" he asked in Spanish. "For someone who isn't here anymore," Maria replied, "but maybe her family will remember." The next morning, Maria arrived at work carrying a large pot of sancocho that had simmered on her hot plate until 3 in the morning. The kitchen filled with aromas that transformed the sterile space into something more intimate. The smell of sofrito, of slow-cooked beef, of love translated into sustenance. Mrs. Morrison found her ladling the stew into bowls, her expression skeptical. "What is this?" "Dominican stew," Maria said simply. "Eleanor's favorite, according to her recipe." "I don't think the family expects—" "They don't expect anything," Maria agreed. "But sometimes we give what's needed, not what's expected." She set the bowls on a tray along with fresh bread from the Latin bakery and carried it to the breakfast room where Richard sat with his usual cup of coffee and untouched plate of toast. "I found Eleanor's recipe box," Maria said, setting the bowl in front of him. "She wrote detailed instructions for sancocho, said it was her great-grandmother's recipe from Santiago." Richard stared at the bowl as if it contained secrets. The steam rose, carrying scents that probably hadn't filled this kitchen in months, since Eleanor had been too sick to cook. He took a tentative spoonful, and Maria watched his face transform. His eyes closed, and for a moment he looked like he might cry. "She made this every Sunday," he said quietly. "Said it reminded her of visiting her grandmother's house when she was little. I haven't tasted it since." He took another spoonful and another. "How did you know?" "I found her recipe box and the pictures and the letters from Santiago." Maria hesitated, then continued. "My mother made sancocho every Sunday too. Said it was food for the soul, not just the body." They sat in companionable silence while Richard ate, really ate, for the first time since Maria had started working there. The kitchen felt different now, warmer, more alive, as if Eleanor's presence had been summoned back through the familiar ritual of feeding people she loved. "Michael and Jessica don't know," Richard said eventually, "about Eleanor's background. She thought it would be easier if they just saw her as, well, as what people expected to see in Pacific Heights. Children should know where they come from," Maria said carefully. "Should know all the parts of their mother, not just the ones that fit into other people's expectations." Richard nodded slowly. "She regretted it, I think. Near the end, she talked about wanting to take the kids to Santiago to meet the family there, but it felt too late by then, too complicated to explain why she'd never mentioned it before." "It's never too late to honor someone's truth," Maria said, "even after they're gone." That afternoon, Michael and Jessica arrived for their weekly duty visit, expecting to find their father in his usual fog of grief. Instead, they found him in the kitchen, washing dishes while humming a tune they didn't recognize. "Dad?" Jessica's voice carried concern and bewilderment. "Are you singing?" "Your mother's song," Richard said, turning to face them both. "She used to hum it while she cooked. It's Dominican, from her grandmother in Santiago." The siblings exchanged glances, clearly confused by this reference to a grandmother they'd never heard mentioned. "I think it's time you learned some things about your mother," Richard continued. "Things she thought would complicate your lives, but that I now think would enrich them." Maria quietly excused herself, but as she left the kitchen, she heard Richard beginning to tell his children about the woman Eleanor had really been, not just the perfect society wife they'd known, but the complex, bicultural woman who'd navigated between worlds with grace and occasional sadness. Later that week, Maria arrived at work to find a note waiting for her. In Richard's careful handwriting, "Thank you for bringing my wife home. Would you consider cooking Sunday dinner for the family? Michael and Jessica are coming, and I think Eleanor would want them to taste her great-grandmother's recipe." Maria folded the note carefully and tucked it into her uniform pocket next to her mother's rosary. For the first time in 30 years of domestic work, she felt like more than just the help. She felt like someone who could bridge worlds, heal wounds, and honor the dead through the simple act of feeding the living. That Sunday, as the Brannigan family gathered around their dining room table to eat sancocho and learn stories about Eleanor they'd never heard before, Maria worked quietly in the kitchen, listening to the sound of a family beginning to remember how to be whole. The house had found its music again, and it sounded like home. The change in the Brannigan household was subtle but unmistakable, like the way morning light gradually pushes back darkness without anyone noticing the exact moment night becomes day. Maria had been there 6 months now, long enough to see patterns, to understand the delicate ecosystem of grief that kept the family frozen in their separate sorrows. But something was shifting. Richard had begun eating regular meals, not just the sancocho that had become their Sunday tradition, but actual breakfasts and lunches that Maria prepared using Eleanor's recipe cards. She'd found dozens of them tucked throughout the house, evidence of a woman who documented her love through careful instructions for feeding her family. Cuban black beans with recipes written in Eleanor's grandmother's Spanish. Connecticut clam chowder adapted from her mother's family traditions. Korean bulgogi from a friend she'd apparently learned to cook with during her years at Yale. Eleanor had been a culinary bridge between worlds, and now Maria was carrying on that tradition. Michael had started staying for dinner after his weekly visits, drawn by aromas that reminded him of childhood Sunday afternoons. He'd even begun helping with dishes afterward, something that surprised James the butler so much that he'd nearly dropped a crystal glass watching the son of the house dry silverware with an old dish rag. Jessica was more resistant to change, approaching each family meal with the cautious hostility of someone expecting to be disappointed. But Maria had noticed her lingering in the kitchen afterward, asking careful questions about ingredients, techniques, the stories behind particular dishes. It was Jessica who'd asked, hesitantly, if Maria knew how to make the Dominican cake Eleanor used to serve at birthday parties. Tres leches with coconut that apparently had been Jessica's favorite as a child. She only made it for special occasions, Jessica had said, her voice carrying a note of vulnerability Maria rarely heard from her. I haven't tasted it since before she got sick. Maria had made the cake for Jessica's 27th birthday, watching as the young woman took her first bite and started crying without explanation. Sometimes, food carried memories too powerful for words, but the most significant change was in Richard himself. He had begun talking, not the stiff, formal conversations that characterized his interactions with business associates, but real talk about Eleanor, about the isolated years since her death, about his fear that he was failing his children by not being the father they needed in their grief. I don't know how to do this without her, he told Maria one evening while she prepared dinner, and he sat at the kitchen counter with a glass of wine. Another new development, a man finally allowing himself small pleasures again. Do what? Maria asked, though she suspected she knew. Be a family. Eleanor was the one who remembered birthdays, who called the kids when they were having problems, who knew what to say when someone was hurting. I was just the provider, the one who made sure the bills were paid and the investments were sound. He swirled the wine in his glass, watching the liquid catch the light. Turns out that's not enough to hold people together. Families aren't business deals, Maria said gently. They don't run on efficiency. They run on showing up even when you don't know what to say. You make it sound simple. Simple isn't the same as easy, Maria replied, her hands busy chopping vegetables for sofrito. Simple just means clear. Show up, pay attention, cook food, listen when people talk. Love doesn't require strategy, Mr. Richard. Just consistency. It was the first time she'd called him by his first name instead of the formal Mr. Brannigan, and something in his face softened at the sound of it. Eleanor used to say something similar, he said. She'd tell me that love was a verb, not a feeling, that it was something you did, not something you fell into. Wise woman, Maria said. You should listen to her. That evening, while cleaning Richard's study, Maria discovered evidence of the man he'd been before grief eclipsed everything else. The walls were lined with awards and commendations, not just for business success, but for philanthropic work. Photos showed him at groundbreaking ceremonies for affordable housing projects, at charity galas for children's hospitals, at investment conferences where his company had apparently committed significant resources to sustainable technology initiatives. There were also family photos that told a different story than the formal portraits in the living room. Richard and Eleanor camping with young children, all of them muddy and laughing. Birthday parties in the backyard where Eleanor wore an apron and Richard grilled hamburgers while chasing toddlers around the patio. A family of people who'd once been silly together, spontaneous, genuinely happy. She insisted on the camping trips, Richard said from the doorway, startling Maria from her careful dusting of the photographs. Every summer, we'd drive to Yosemite or Lake Tahoe and spend a week in a tent. The kids complained, especially when they got older, but she said it was important for them to know how to be happy with just each other. When did you stop going? Maria asked. When Michael started his company and Jessica got her MBA, everyone got too busy for camping. He picked up one of the photos, the four of them around a campfire, Eleanor making s'mores while the kids groaned about sticky fingers, and Richard tried to look dignified while wearing a ridiculous fishing hat. Eleanor wanted to keep the tradition going, just the two of us, but I said we were too old for sleeping on the ground. The regret in his voice was palpable. Maria understood that this was another kind of grief, not just mourning the person who died, but mourning the experiences they'd never have, the traditions they'd let slip away. You could start new traditions, she suggested carefully. With Michael and Jessica, different than camping, but still together. They're busy, successful. They have their own lives. Everyone's busy, Maria said, thinking of her own children, how Carlos worked double shifts at the garage to save money for his daughter's quinceañera, how Sophia pulled extra nursing shifts to pay off her student loans, but still called every Sunday. Busy is just another way of saying you haven't decided what's important. That weekend, instead of the usual formal dinner where conversation felt like a performance none of them wanted to give, Richard proposed something different. A cooking lesson. He wanted to learn how to make Eleanor's tres leches cake himself, wanted to understand the process that had created such joy for his daughter. Maria found herself in the unusual position of teaching a millionaire how to separate eggs and fold batter without overmixing. Richard approached the lesson with the same intensity he'd probably once brought to merger negotiations, measuring ingredients with scientific precision and following instructions as if they were legal contracts. You're overthinking it, Maria told him, when his first attempt at folding the flour resulted in a dense, flat mixture. Cooking isn't engineering. It requires intuition, not just precision. Eleanor made it look easy, Richard said, starting over with a fresh bowl of eggs, because she'd done it 100 times, because she cooked with love, not fear. Maria demonstrated the gentle folding motion, the way to incorporate ingredients without destroying the air bubbles that would make the cake light. Here, try again. But this time, think about Jessica's face when she tasted this cake on her birthday. Think about wanting to give her that joy again. The second attempt was better, not perfect, but edible. When Jessica and Michael arrived for Sunday dinner and found their father wearing one of Eleanor's aprons, covered in flour and proud as a child with a good report card, something shifted in the family dynamic. Dad made dessert, Richard announced, as if this were a completely normal development instead of something that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. The cake was slightly lopsided, and the tres leches soaking wasn't quite even, but when Jessica tasted it, her eyes filled with tears for the second time in recent memory. It tastes like Mom's, she whispered. I had a good teacher, Richard said, glancing at Maria with something that looked like gratitude mixed with surprise, as if he'd just discovered he was capable of something he'd never imagined. That evening, as Maria prepared to leave for the day, she found Richard waiting by the front door with an envelope in his hands. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, "about showing up, about consistency, about love being a verb." He held out the envelope. "This is a bonus, not for your housekeeping, but for helping me remember how to be a father." Maria opened the envelope and found a check for an amount that made her hands shake slightly. More than she made in 2 months, enough to finally replace her aging refrigerator, to send some money to Sophia for her student loans, to put aside something for the future that suddenly seemed less frightening. "This is too much," she said. "It's not enough," Richard replied. "You gave me back my children. You gave me back my wife's memory. You can't put a price on that." But as Maria folded the check carefully into her purse, she knew the real gift hadn't been money. The real gift had been watching a broken family learn how to love each other again, learning that her work mattered for reasons that had nothing to do with clean floors or perfect meals. She was no longer just the help. She was the keeper of traditions, the bridge between past and present, the quiet force that had helped the Brannigans remember who they used to be and who they might become again. The bus ride home that night felt different, the city lights blurring past the window like promises of possibility. Maria had spent 30 years working in other people's homes, caring for other people's families, and for the first time, she felt like she truly belonged where she was. Not because they needed her to clean their house, but because they needed her to help them remember how to be home. The 8th month of Maria's employment brought an unexpected crisis that would test everything she'd built with the Brannigan family. It began, as most disasters do, with something small that should have stayed buried. Richard had been having what he called good days, mornings when he woke before his alarm, afternoons when he didn't disappear into his study, evenings when he actually seemed to enjoy the company of his children. The house felt different now, warmer, with curtains open and music playing softly from speakers Eleanor had installed in every room, but no one had used since her death. Maria had established her own rhythms within this new ecosystem. She arrived each morning to find Richard in the kitchen, often already starting coffee in the expensive machine Eleanor had taught him to use. They would discuss the day's menu, which family recipes to prepare, whether Michael and Jessica might stay for dinner. These conversations had become some of the most peaceful moments of Maria's working life. Two people planning acts of nurturing without any agenda beyond feeding the people they cared about. But peace, Maria had learned over 30 years of domestic work, was often temporary in wealthy households. The trouble began when Richard's sister Patricia arrived from New York for an unannounced visit. Patricia Wellington had married into old Connecticut money, the kind of family wealth that came with assumed superiority and careful attention to bloodlines. She swept into the house wearing designer clothes that probably cost more than Maria's annual rent, her sharp eyes immediately cataloging changes in the household that clearly displeased her. "Richard, darling," she said, air-kissing her brother while simultaneously assessing Maria, who was arranging fresh flowers in the front hall. "I see you've made some adjustments to the household routine." Maria felt the chill immediately. This was a woman who knew how to deliver insults wrapped in politeness, who'd perfected the art of making people feel small without saying anything directly actionable. "Patricia," Richard's greeting was notably less enthusiastic. "I didn't know you were coming." "Eleanor's death anniversary is next month," Patricia said, as if Richard might have forgotten. "I thought it was important to see how you're coping. The children are concerned." This was news to Maria, who'd seen Michael and Jessica regularly and observed their relationships with their father gradually healing. But she understood that Patricia was speaking in code. "The children are concerned" meant, "I disapprove of whatever's happening here, and I'm using them as cover for my interference." Over the next 3 days, Patricia made her position clear through a series of devastating observations, delivered with surgical precision. The house was too warm now, lacking the sophisticated atmosphere Eleanor had maintained. The family dinners were too casual, without proper service or appropriate conversation. Most damaging of all, she questioned whether it was appropriate for Richard to be so dependent on domestic help for what should be family functions. Eleanor never expected the help to do more than cleaning, Patricia mentioned during one particularly tense family dinner, her eyes fixed on Maria as she served the sancocho that had become their Sunday tradition. She believed in maintaining proper boundaries between family and staff. The words hit Maria like physical blows. After 8 months of feeling like part of something, of believing her presence mattered for reasons beyond her cleaning skills, she was being reduced to the help again. Worse, the criticism was being delivered using Eleanor's memory as a weapon, suggesting that Eleanor would have disapproved of the very intimacy that had helped heal her family. Richard said nothing in her defense. Michael and Jessica, perhaps intimidated by their aunt's certainty or simply caught off guard, remained silent. Maria finished serving dinner and retreated to the kitchen, her hands shaking as she prepared to load the dishwasher. But the worst was yet to come. The next morning, Maria arrived to find Patricia in the kitchen with Mrs. Morrison, both women examining a small silver frame that usually sat on Eleanor's bedside table. Maria recognized it immediately, a wedding photo of Eleanor and Richard taken at City Hall, because Eleanor had insisted on a simple ceremony despite Richard's wealth. "I found this in the cleaning supply closet," Patricia was saying, her voice carrying the triumphant note of someone who'd discovered evidence of wrongdoing. "Hidden behind bottles of floor cleaner." Maria's stomach dropped. She knew exactly what had happened. She'd been dusting Eleanor's bedroom the previous afternoon and had accidentally knocked the frame behind the narrow table that held cleaning supplies. But in Patricia's hands, the incident looked like theft, like evidence of the kind of behavior wealthy families were supposed to expect from their domestic help. "There must be an explanation," Mrs. Morrison said, though her tone suggested she wasn't particularly interested in hearing one. "The explanation is quite obvious," Patricia replied coldly. "Though I suppose we should give her a chance to provide her version before we call the police." The word police hit Maria like ice water. In her 30 years of domestic work, she'd never been accused of stealing, had never given anyone reason to question her integrity, but she understood that in situations like this, her word meant nothing against Patricia's assumptions and social position. When Richard arrived in the kitchen 20 minutes later, he found Maria sitting quietly at the counter, while Patricia detailed her discovery with the kind of prosecutorial precision that suggested she'd been preparing this moment since her arrival. "I hate to say this, Richard, but I think you've been too trusting, too isolated in your grief to see what's been happening in your own home." Patricia's voice dripped with false sympathy. "Eleanor's things have been going missing for months, I'm sure, but you haven't noticed because you've been so dependent on this woman for emotional support." Maria watched Richard's face as he absorbed the accusation. For a moment, she saw doubt flicker in his eyes. Not doubt about her character, she realized, but doubt about his own judgment. Patricia was attacking not just Maria's integrity, but Richard's competence, his ability to manage his own household, his recovery from grief. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of 8 months of shared meals, quiet conversations, and the slow rebuilding of a family. Maria had helped Richard remember how to be a father, had brought Eleanor's recipes and traditions back to life, had created warmth where there had been only coldness. But now she was just the help again, and the help was always guilty until proven innocent. "I knocked the frame behind the table yesterday while dusting," Maria said quietly, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "I didn't realize it had fallen so far back. I would have retrieved it today during my regular cleaning." "How convenient," Patricia said. "And I suppose you have witnesses to this accident?" "I was alone in the room," Maria admitted. "But I've never taken anything from this house. In 30 years of domestic work, I've never—" "Yes, well, people say all sorts of things when they're caught," Patricia interrupted. "The question is whether Richard is going to continue enabling this situation or whether he's going to protect his family's interests." The ultimatum hung in the air, like smoke from a fire no one wanted to acknowledge. Patricia was forcing Richard to choose between his sister's version of propriety and the woman who'd helped heal his family, between maintaining his social position and defending someone who couldn't defend herself. Maria had seen this scenario play out in other households over the years. Wealthy families closed ranks when challenged, and domestic workers were expendable in ways that family members weren't. She began calculating bus schedules, wondering how long it would take to find another position, whether her age and accent would make the search even more difficult than usual. But then Richard did something unexpected. He walked to the cleaning supply closet, moved the bottles of floor cleaner, and examined the narrow space behind the table. When he straightened up, he was holding a small earring, one of Eleanor's, ornate and distinctive, that had apparently fallen into the same space as the picture frame. "This was Eleanor's," he said, showing the earring to Patricia. "She lost it months ago, looked everywhere for it, said it was one of her favorites from her grandmother in Santiago." He turned to Maria with something that looked like understanding mixed with apology. "You were dusting back there yesterday?" "Yes, sir. I dust behind all the furniture in the bedroom every Thursday." "And you didn't mention finding this earring?" "I didn't see it," Maria said honestly. "The frame fell while I was working. I heard something drop but couldn't see what it was in that narrow space." Richard nodded slowly, then looked at his sister with an expression Maria had never seen from him before, disappointing mixed with determination. "Patricia, I think there's been a misunderstanding here." "Richard, please don't tell me you're going to—" "I'm going to trust the woman who's helped put my family back together," Richard said firmly. "Maria has been nothing but honest and loyal in the 8 months she's worked here. She's helped Michael and Jessica reconnect with their mother's memory, helped me remember how to be a father instead of just a provider." Patricia's face flushed with anger. "You're being manipulated, Richard. This woman has inserted herself into your family." "This woman," Richard interrupted, his voice carrying a note of authority Maria hadn't heard before, "has shown my children more care and attention in 8 months than most people show in a lifetime. She's brought Eleanor's traditions back to this house, taught me how to cook my wife's recipes, helped my son learn to grieve properly, and my daughter remember joy." He turned to Maria, and she saw something in his expression that made her chest tight with emotion. "I owe you an apology," he said, "for allowing you to be put in this position, for not defending you immediately. You've never given me reason to doubt your integrity, and I should have said so from the beginning." The kitchen fell silent, except for the soft hum of expensive appliances and the distant sound of San Francisco traffic. Patricia's mouth opened and closed like she was trying to form words that wouldn't come. Mrs. Morrison studied her hands with great interest. "I think you should leave," Richard told his sister quietly. "You've upset my household and insulted someone who's become important to my family. That's not acceptable to me." Patricia's departure was swift and bitter, accompanied by predictions of disaster and threats to discuss this situation with the children. But her words felt empty now, the power drained from them by Richard's public defense of Maria's character and importance to his family. After Patricia's taxi disappeared down the hill toward the airport, Richard found Maria in Eleanor's garden, pulling weeds around the roses with the methodical precision of someone working through complex emotions. "She was wrong," he said without preamble, "about everything, about you, about boundaries, about what Eleanor would have wanted." Maria continued working, her hands busy in the soil. "Your sister loves you. She's afraid you're being taken advantage of." "Are you? Taking advantage of me?" Maria looked up at him then. This man who'd defended her when he could have taken the easier path of simply letting her go. "Do you think I am?" "I think you saved my family," Richard said simply. "I think Eleanor sent you to us somehow when we needed you most. I think trying to explain that to Patricia would be like trying to explain color to someone who's been blind since birth." They worked together in comfortable silence, tending Eleanor's roses as the afternoon sun slanted through the fog rolling in from the Pacific. And Maria understood that something fundamental had shifted in her relationship with the Brannigan family. She was no longer just the help who'd proven her trustworthiness. She was someone worth defending, worth protecting, worth keeping. For the first time in 30 years of domestic work, Maria felt truly secure in a position, not because she was indispensable as a cleaner, but because she'd become indispensable as a person. The roses seemed to sense it too, blooming more vibrantly than ever in the soil they tended together. The anniversary of Eleanor's death approached like a storm system Maria could see forming on the horizon, inevitable, potentially destructive, requiring careful preparation for survival. She'd been with the family now for 10 months, long enough to understand that grief anniversaries in wealthy households became elaborate performances of remembrance that often had more to do with social expectations than genuine mourning. But Richard surprised her by asking for something different. "I don't want a memorial service this year," he announced one evening while Maria prepared dinner, and he sat at the counter with his nightly glass of wine, a ritual that had evolved into their most honest conversations. Last year was all flowers from florists who never met her and speeches from people who barely knew her. Eleanor would have hated it. Maria paused in her chopping of cilantro, recognizing the weight of what he was really saying. "What do you want instead?" "I want to remember her the way she actually was, not the way people needed her to be." Richard swirled his wine thoughtfully. "I want Michael and Jessica to understand who their mother really was. The woman who grew up between two cultures, who spoke Spanish to her grandmother and learned to sail from her Connecticut relatives. The woman who made sancocho every Sunday and also threw dinner parties for 50 people who never knew her real name was Elena, not Eleanor." Maria's knife stilled completely. In 10 months, Richard had revealed many things about Eleanor, but this was new information that recontextualized everything she thought she understood about the family. "Elena," she repeated softly. "Her grandmother called her Elena. Her Dominican family still calls her Elena. But when she married me, when we moved to Pacific Heights, she became Eleanor because it was easier. Because people expected Richard Brannigan's wife to be Eleanor, not Elena." His voice carried regret heavy as fog rolling in from the bay. "I should have fought for her right to be herself." "Did she regret it?" Maria asked gently. "I think so, especially toward the end, when she was talking about wanting the children to know their Dominican family, wanting to take them to Santiago to meet the cousins who still call her Elena." Richard finished his wine in one long swallow. "She died planning a trip she never took, carrying secrets that weren't shameful but felt too complicated to explain." Maria understood this burden intimately, the weight of being someone different at work than you were at home, the exhaustion of translating yourself for other people's comfort. Eleanor had been successful at it in ways Maria had never been, wealthy enough to make the performance seamless, but the cost had apparently been the same, losing pieces of yourself until you weren't sure which version was real. "What do you want to do for the anniversary?" Maria asked. "I want to cook her favorite meal, not the fancy French food she served to guests, but the simple Dominican food she made when it was just family. I want to play her music, the merengue she danced to when she thought no one was listening. I want to tell Michael and Jessica stories about their mother they've never heard before." Richard looked up at Maria with something that resembled hope. "And I want you to help me do it right." The request was both honor and responsibility. Maria understood that she was being asked to serve as cultural translator, to help Richard navigate traditions and customs he'd observed, but never fully understood. More than that, she was being invited to help a family reclaim authenticity they'd never known they'd lost. Planning Elena's memorial became an exercise in archaeological reconstruction. Maria and Richard worked together to unearth the woman who'd lived beneath Eleanor's polished surface, piecing together clues from recipe cards, photograph collections, and the small artifacts Elena had hidden throughout the house like messages to her future self. They found letters from cousins in Santiago, written in Spanish and full of family news Eleanor had never shared with her children. They discovered a small altar tucked in the back of Eleanor's closet, not the kind of obvious shrine that would have seemed strange to Pacific Heights visitors, but a subtle arrangement of candles, photographs, and religious medals that spoke of private devotion. Most significantly, they found Eleanor's journal from the months before her death, pages filled with reflections on identity, belonging, and the price of assimilation that had followed her throughout her marriage. "I wonder sometimes if Richard married Eleanor or Elena," one entry read. "If our children know their mother or just the performance I've given for 25 years. I love the life we've built, but I miss the woman I used to be when no one was watching." Reading these words, Richard wept for the first time since the funeral. Not the controlled grieving he'd done in public, but raw sobs that seemed to come from his bones. Maria held the journal while he cried, understanding that he was mourning not just Eleanor's death, but Elena's long disappearance, the gradual erasure of the woman he'd fallen in love with in favor of the wife Pacific Heights expected him to have. "I failed her," he said through tears. "I let her disappear rather than fighting for her right to be whole." "You loved who she became," Maria said gently, "but now you can honor who she was." The memorial they planned bore no resemblance to the formal service of the previous year. Instead of hiring caterers, Maria taught Richard and his children how to make Elena's favorite dishes from childhood memories and recipe cards. Michael, who'd never been interested in cooking, found himself carefully forming empanadas while Maria told stories about Elena's grandmother, who'd apparently taught her that food was love made visible. Jessica discovered her mother's collection of Dominican music, forgotten vinyl records tucked behind the classical albums Eleanor had displayed publicly. The sound of meringue filling the house was revelatory. Suddenly, the formal spaces took on different energy, as if the music was calling back the soul that had been suppressed for decades. "She used to dance to this?" Jessica asked, watching her father move awkwardly to rhythms he'd obviously observed but never participated in. "Every Saturday while she cooked," Richard said. "She'd put on Juan Luis Guerra or Wilfrido Vargas and dance around the kitchen like she was 17 again. I used to watch from the doorway, thinking she was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen." "Why didn't she dance with us?" Michael asked, his voice carrying childhood hurt Maria hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "Because she thought you'd be embarrassed," Richard said honestly. "Because Pacific Heights doesn't dance meringue, and she didn't want you to feel different from your friends." The tragedy of assimilation laid bare. A woman who'd hidden her joy to protect her children from otherness, children who'd grown up without understanding the fullness of their heritage, because their mother was protecting them from discrimination she'd experienced herself. But it wasn't too late for discovery. Maria spent the week before the anniversary teaching the family dances Elena had apparently known by heart, showing them how to move their hips to Caribbean rhythms that were part of their inheritance. Richard was hopeless at it, but his attempts were so sincere and joyful that even his children laughed, not at him, but with the delight of seeing their father embrace something outside his usual careful control. Jessica turned out to have natural rhythm, probably inherited from Elena along with her delicate features. Michael was more mechanical, but he approached learning meringue with the same intensity he'd once brought to coding, determined to master something that connected him to his mother's hidden self. The anniversary evening arrived wrapped in typical San Francisco fog, but the Brannigan house glowed with warmth that seemed to push back the darkness. Maria had prepared Elena's favorite meal: pernil roasted with sofrito, rice with pigeon peas, sweet plantains that caramelized until they seemed like candy. The dining room table was set with Eleanor's good china, but the formal atmosphere was softened by candles that flickered in the ocean breeze and photographs of Elena as a young woman in Santiago, dancing at village festivals with her cousins. For the first time since Eleanor's death, the house felt truly alive. They ate Elena's food while Richard told stories his children had never heard, about their mother calling her grandmother every Sunday to practice Spanish, about her secret donations to Dominican charities, about the trip to Santiago she'd been planning when cancer interrupted everything. Michael and Jessica learned they had cousins their age still living in Elena's childhood neighborhood, extended family who sent Christmas cards every year that Eleanor had never mentioned. "Why didn't she tell us?" Jessica asked, though her voice carried curiosity rather than anger now. Because she thought it would complicate your lives, Richard said. Because she was protecting you from questions she'd learned to dread. Where are you really from? What kind of name is Elena? Why don't you look like what people expect? After dinner, they danced. Maria put on Elena's favorite Juan Luis Guerra album and taught them bachata, the romantic dance Elena had apparently shared with Richard during their early courtship. Watching Richard dance with his daughter while merengue played in the background, seeing Michael awkwardly but gamely attempt to follow Maria's instruction, she understood that this was what healing looked like, not forgetting the past, but integrating all parts of it into something whole. Later, as Maria cleaned the kitchen while the family continued dancing in the living room, she found a note tucked under one of Elena's recipe cards. In Eleanor's careful handwriting, "Para la mujer que comes después de mí. Thank you for continuing what I couldn't finish. For the woman who comes after me." Elena had somehow known that someone like Maria would eventually join their family, someone who could bridge the cultural gaps Elena had spent years widening in the name of fitting in. The note felt like a blessing, a passing of responsibility from one immigrant woman to another. When Maria finally left that night, Richard walked her to the front door, something he'd never done before. "Thank you," he said simply, "for giving us back Elena, for helping us understand there was never anything shameful about who she really was." "She never went away," Maria replied. "She just got quiet. You helped her find her voice again." As Maria walked down the hill toward the bus stop, merengue still drifting from the open windows of the Brannigan house, she understood that something profound had shifted. The family had learned to honor all parts of their heritage, to celebrate rather than hide the complexity of their mother's identity. And Maria had learned that her own cultural knowledge was not something to minimize or apologize for, but a gift she could offer to families navigating their own relationships with authenticity and belonging. The fog rolled in from the Pacific, wrapping San Francisco in its nightly embrace, but the warmth from the Brannigan house seemed to push back the darkness, promising clearer skies ahead. 1 year after her arrival at the Brannigan estate, Maria understood that she'd become something she'd never expected to be. Not just domestic help, but family archaeologist, cultural translator, and keeper of secrets that were finally safe to share. The transformation hadn't been dramatic or sudden. It had crept in quietly, like morning light gradually illuminating rooms that had been dark for too long. The house itself reflected the change. Curtains stayed open now, revealing the spectacular views Eleanor had originally designed the space to showcase. The kitchen smelled regularly of real cooking, not just the precise meals Mrs. Morrison had maintained during the months of grief, but the experimental, joyful kind of cooking that happened when people cooked together rather than simply being served. Music played throughout the day from speakers Eleanor had installed, but the family had forgotten how to use. Sometimes it was the merengue and bachata that had become their way of staying connected to Elena's memory. But other times it was jazz or classical, or even the indie rock Michael had introduced during one of his increasingly frequent weekend visits. The most significant change, though, was in the family dynamics themselves. Michael had begun staying for entire weekends, bringing his laptop and working from his mother's former study while helping Maria perfect his grandmother's empanada recipe. His relationship with his father had evolved from dutiful visits into genuine friendship, both men learning to navigate grief by moving through it together rather than around it. Jessica had started calling twice a week instead of once, often asking to speak with Maria as much as with her father. She'd begun learning Spanish from a tutor in her Nob Hill apartment, determined to communicate with the Dominican cousins she'd never known existed. Her conversations with Maria had become a bridge between the worlds Elena had kept separate. Pacific Heights sophistication and Santiago family loyalty could coexist, Jessica was discovering, in ways her mother had never felt safe to explore. But the most significant transformation was in Richard himself. The man who'd hired Maria 12 months earlier had been professionally successful but emotionally defunct, going through the motions of living without any apparent joy in the process. This Richard laughed during dinner conversations, asked questions about Maria's children with genuine interest, and had begun planning a trip to Santiago to meet Elena's family, something Eleanor had dreamed of but never accomplished. More importantly, he'd learned to see Maria not as domestic help, but as someone whose wisdom and cultural knowledge had become essential to his family's well-being, which made the conversation that came on a foggy Thursday morning in November both completely unexpected and entirely predictable. Maria arrived to find Richard in the kitchen earlier than usual, sitting at the counter with 2 cups of coffee and an expression she couldn't quite read. Not troubled exactly, but serious in a way that suggested important business needed to be discussed. "We need to talk," he said without preamble, gesturing to the second coffee cup. Maria's stomach dropped. In 30 years of domestic work, "we need to talk" conversations usually ended with termination, reduction in hours, or some other upheaval that left her scrambling to reorganize her life around new financial realities. But Richard's tone didn't carry the distance that usually accompanied bad news from employers. "I've been thinking about your living situation," he continued. "That studio apartment in the Mission, it's not safe for someone your age to be taking public transportation at all hours, especially when you stay late here." Maria sipped her coffee, waiting for whatever request or criticism was coming. She'd grown used to wealthy families expressing concern about her welfare as a prelude to asking her to sacrifice more of her time or accept less convenient working conditions for their benefit. "I want you to move into the house," Richard said simply, "permanently. There's a beautiful apartment above the garage that Eleanor designed but we never used. Full kitchen, separate entrance, complete privacy. You'd still have your own life, your own space, but you wouldn't have to commute every day." The proposal was so unexpected that Maria nearly choked on her coffee. Live-in domestic help was common in Pacific Heights, but those arrangements typically involved small, cramped quarters and complete availability to the family. What Richard was describing sounded like actual housing, actual space to exist as a human being rather than simply as a service provider. "I know it's a big change," Richard continued, interpreting her silence as reluctance. "But honestly, Maria, you've become family to us. Not having you here every day feels wrong now. The house is better when you're in it." Family. The word hit Maria like sunlight breaking through fog. In 30 years of domestic work, she'd cared for dozens of families, had been fond of many of them, had even been appreciated by some, but she'd never been considered family by the people who employed her. "What would my responsibilities be?" she asked carefully, understanding that live-in positions often expanded far beyond the originally agreed-upon duties. "The same as now," Richard said. "Cooking when you feel like it, helping maintain Elena's traditions, being yourself. You wouldn't be on call 24 hours. This isn't about making you more available to serve us. It's about acknowledging that you belong here now." Maria walked to the kitchen window that looked out on Elena's garden, where roses continued blooming into the late fall because someone finally cared for them consistently. The view from this window had become one of her favorite things about working here. The way morning light caught the dewdrops on petals, the satisfaction of seeing plants thriving under attention rather than withering from neglect. The apartment above the garage would have similar views, she realized. She would wake up to the same garden she'd helped restore, fall asleep to the same city sounds that had become familiar over 12 months of daily commuting. More than that, she would finally have space. The studio apartment in the Mission had served its purpose, but it was cramped and noisy, shared walls with neighbors who played music too loud and kept irregular hours. The thought of having actual rooms, of being able to cook without everything smelling like whatever she'd prepared for dinner, of having guests without having to sit on her bed because there was nowhere else, it was almost too good to imagine. "I'd like to see the apartment," she said finally. The space above the garage had been designed as guest quarters but furnished as fantasy. What Eleanor had apparently imagined perfect accommodations would look like for extended stay visitors who never materialized. The living room had windows on 3 sides, offering panoramic views of the garden, the bay, and the city beyond. The kitchen was compact but perfectly appointed, with granite counters and appliances that were scaled for actual cooking rather than mere convenience. The bedroom was large enough for a queen bed and still have space for a reading chair, while the bathroom included a soaking tub that probably cost more than Maria's annual rent. Everything was decorated in soft blues and whites that made the space feel serene rather than showily expensive. "Eleanor designed it for your mother," Richard said, watching Maria take in the space. "She used to talk about convincing your mother to spend time here, said she wanted to spoil her properly after all the years she'd taken care of other people." The revelation that Eleanor had thought about Maria's mother, had considered her comfort and well-being, brought tears Maria hadn't expected. Her mother had died working until the end, cleaning houses well into her 70s because she couldn't afford to retire. The idea that someone had imagined giving her luxury, treating her like a beloved relative rather than hired help, felt like healing a wound Maria hadn't realized she was carrying. "Would I pay rent?" Maria asked, still trying to understand the practical details of Richard's offer. "You'd pay what you pay now for the Mission apartment," Richard said, "not because I need the money, but because I know it would feel strange to you to live here without contributing something. The difference is, here you'd have space, security, and you'd be close to people who care about you. People who care about you." The phrase settled into Maria's chest like warmth on a cold day. After 30 years of being helpful but disposable, appreciated but replaceable, she'd found a situation where her presence mattered for reasons that had nothing to do with her utility. That evening, Maria called her children to discuss Richard's offer. Carlos was suspicious at first. He'd inherited his mother's wariness about offers that seemed too good to be true from wealthy employers. But when Maria described the family's transformation, the cultural connections they'd rebuilt, the way Richard had defended her against his sister's accusations, Carlos began to understand that this was different. "You sound happy, Mama," he said finally. "I can't remember the last time you sounded this happy talking about work." Sophia was more immediately enthusiastic. As a nurse, she understood the value of stable housing in expensive cities, knew that Maria's current commute was becoming more difficult as she aged. "Take it," she said without hesitation. "You've spent 30 years taking care of other people's families. Let them take care of you for a change." The move happened gradually, over 2 weeks, Maria transferring her belongings in stages to avoid disrupting the household routine. Her possessions looked sparse in the studio apartment, but felt abundant in the larger space above the garage. Books she'd collected over decades finally had proper shelves. Kitchen tools she'd kept in boxes found homes and drawers designed for organization. Photographs of her children and grandchildren could be displayed prominently rather than tucked into corners. The first morning Maria woke up in her new home, she lay in bed listening to sounds that were becoming familiar. Richard starting coffee in the kitchen below, birds in Elena's garden, the distant hum of traffic on Divisadero. But she was no longer rushing to catch buses, no longer calculating transit time against productivity expectations. She was home, in a way she'd never expected to be home anywhere outside her own family. When she appeared in the kitchen that morning, Richard smiled at her over his coffee cup with an expression that looked like satisfaction mixed with relief. "How did you sleep?" "Like I belonged here," Maria said, and realized she meant it. The day proceeded with the rhythm they'd established over 12 months. But everything felt different now that Maria wasn't watching the clock for departure times. She could take longer with preparations, could experiment with new recipes, could simply exist in the space without constantly calculating whether her presence was justified by productivity. That afternoon, while preparing dinner, she looked out the kitchen window and saw Richard in Elena's garden, pruning roses with careful attention to the techniques she'd taught him. This had become another of their shared rituals, tending the space Eleanor had created, keeping alive the beauty she'd planted. Michael arrived for dinner carrying flowers from a shop in the Castro, not the expensive arrangements Patricia had favored, but simple mixed bouquets that reminded Maria of the family pictures she'd seen of Elena as a young woman in Santiago. Jessica brought wine and stories from her Spanish lessons, excited to share progress she was making toward eventual communication with the Dominican cousins they had all committed to visiting. As they sat around the dining table, not the formal dining room where Patricia had tried to establish hierarchies, but the kitchen table where they'd learned to be family, Maria understood that her position in this household had evolved into something unprecedented in her experience. She wasn't the help anymore. She wasn't quite family in the traditional sense either. She was something new, a chosen relative, someone who'd earned her place through loyalty and love rather than biology or marriage. Later that evening, as Maria climbed the stairs to her own apartment, her own space, her own sanctuary, she paused on the landing to look back at the main house. Lights glowed in windows throughout the mansion, evidence of a family that had learned to live fully again, rather than simply existing in beautiful rooms. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new conversations, new opportunities to nurture the relationships she'd helped heal. But tonight, for the first time in 30 years of domestic work, Maria fell asleep in space that belonged to her, surrounded by people who saw her whole self rather than just her usefulness. The fog rolled in from the Pacific as always, but it no longer felt like something Maria needed to rush home ahead of. She was already home, and home was finally a place where she was wanted not just for what she could do, but for who she was. 2 years had passed since Maria first walked through the wrought iron gates of the Brannigan estate, nervous and uncertain, carrying cleaning supplies in a wheeled cart that had seen better decades. Now she carried keys to her own apartment, worn her own path through Elena's garden, and established her own routines in a house that had learned to breathe again. The transformation was complete, though it had happened so gradually that sometimes Maria had to consciously remember how different everything had been when she'd first arrived to find a mansion frozen in grief, a family scattered by loss, and a man who'd forgotten how to find joy in anything beyond stock portfolios and cryptocurrency investments. This morning, like every morning for the past 18 months, Maria woke up in her apartment above the garage and looked out at views that still seemed impossible. The bay sparkling in early light, the garden Elena had planted blooming in careful succession, the city of San Francisco spreading below in all its complicated beauty. The apartment had become truly hers now, decorated with photographs and keepsakes that told the story of her life, furnished with comfort rather than merely function. She made coffee in her own kitchen, real coffee from beans Richard had taught her to select at the specialty shop in Union Square, where Eleanor had been a regular customer. The ritual had become one of her favorite parts of each day. The grinding of beans, the careful measurement of water, the moment when the kitchen filled with aromas that promised warmth and consciousness, and another day of meaningful work. But this morning carried special significance. Today marked exactly 2 years since her arrival, and Richard had asked her to prepare a celebration dinner, not for her employment anniversary, but for what he called her arrival in the family anniversary. It was a distinction that still amazed Maria, even after becoming accustomed to being treated as valued family member rather than hired help. The menu for tonight's dinner reflected the journey they had all taken together. Maria would prepare Elena's favorite dishes alongside some of Eleanor's Connecticut family recipes, representing the cultural bridge Elena had spent her lifetime building and the family had learned to honor. Michael had requested the tres leches cake that had become his signature dessert to make for special occasions, while Jessica had asked for the merengue playlist they'd assembled from Elena's record collection. But the most significant addition to tonight's celebration would be new voices around the table. 3 months earlier, Maria had finally accompanied the Brannigan family to Santiago, Dominican Republic, to meet Elena's relatives, the cousins and aunts and extended family members who'd spent decades sending Christmas cards to a woman who'd never been able to introduce her children to their heritage. The trip had been revelatory for everyone involved, but especially for Michael and Jessica, who discovered not just family members but aspects of themselves they'd never known existed. Now, Elena's cousin Mercedes was visiting San Francisco for the first time, staying in the main house guest room and marveling at the way Elena's American family had learned to integrate Dominican traditions into their Pacific Heights lifestyle. Mercedes spoke limited English, but her conversations with Maria in rapid Spanish had brought another layer of authenticity to the household, another connection to Elena's true self. Maria was preparing sofrito when she heard familiar footsteps on the kitchen's marble floors. Richard appeared in the doorway, already dressed for his day, but carrying the relaxed energy he'd developed over the past 2 years. The driven, anxious man who'd hired her had evolved into someone who understood that success without relationship was just elaborate loneliness. "Buenos dias," he said, his pronunciation still careful but much improved since he'd begun taking Spanish lessons to prepare for their trip to Santiago. "Buenos dias, Ricardo," Maria replied, using the Spanish version of his name that Mercedes had introduced and that he'd grown to prefer in family settings. He poured himself coffee from the machine Eleanor had taught him to use, but that he'd now mastered well enough to teach others. The morning ritual had become one of their most comfortable interactions, two people who'd learned to appreciate each other's presence without needing constant conversation to fill the space. Mercedes was asking about Eleanor's rose garden this morning, Richard said, settling at the counter where he'd spent hundreds of mornings over the past 2 years. Apparently, Elena used to send photographs of it to the family in Santiago, but Mercedes says the pictures didn't capture how beautiful it actually is. Maria smiled, understanding the deeper meaning behind Mercedes' observation. Photographs could record images, but they couldn't capture the care that made gardens thrive, the attention that made houses feel like homes, the love that transformed formal spaces into places where people wanted to spend time. Elena knew how to make beautiful things, Maria said, her hands continuing to work the garlic and cilantro that would become the base for tonight's pernil. But more than that, she knew how to share beauty, to make other people feel included in beautiful things. It was one of the insights Maria had developed about Elena over 2 years of living with her memory, cooking from her recipes, and listening to stories from people who'd known different aspects of her personality. Elena had been a curator of experiences, someone who understood that wealth was meaningless unless it created opportunities for connection and joy. "I wish she could see what her family has become," Richard said quietly. "How much happier Michael and Jessica are now that they understand all parts of their heritage. How much more connected we all are to each other." "Maybe she can see," Maria suggested. "Maybe bringing Mercedes here, learning to cook Elena's recipes, playing her music in the house again. Maybe that's how we make sure someone doesn't really die." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Jessica, who'd driven over from her apartment to help with dinner preparations. In the 2 years since Maria had started working for the family, Jessica had evolved from suspicious and somewhat hostile to genuinely warm, though it had taken time for her to learn to see Maria as something other than hired help. "Mercedes wants to learn how to make Elena's empanadas," Jessica announced, hanging her jacket on the back of a kitchen chair with the casual familiarity of someone who'd grown up in this space. "She says our Dominican cousins don't believe that Elena taught her American family how to cook properly." Maria laughed, understanding the competitive dynamics of extended families everywhere. Dominican cousins wanted to make sure their American relatives weren't embarrassing Elena's memory with inadequate cooking, while the American family wanted to prove they'd learned their lessons well enough to honor their mother's traditions. "We'll show them," Maria said. Elena wrote very detailed recipe cards. She wanted to make sure anyone could follow her instructions. The afternoon passed in comfortable chaos as Mercedes, Jessica, Maria, and eventually Michael and Richard worked together to prepare Elena's favorite meal. The kitchen filled with Spanish and English, laughter and gentle arguments about proper technique, the kind of multilingual, multi-generational cooking session that Maria remembered from her own childhood, but that had become rare in her adult life of working alone in other people's kitchens. Mercedes proved to be an enthusiastic but demanding teacher, correcting their Spanish pronunciation and insisting on traditional preparation methods that Elena had apparently modernized for American kitchens. But her critiques came with warmth and obvious delight at seeing Elena's recipes being prepared with care and attention, rather than simply preserved as museum pieces. "Elena siempre hablaba de sus niños americanos," Mercedes said to Maria while they shaped empanadas together, her hands moving with the unconscious expertise of someone who'd been making this food since childhood. Always talked about her American children, how smart they were, how successful, but also how she worried they wouldn't understand where they came from. "They understand now," Maria replied in Spanish, watching Jessica carefully crimp empanada edges under Mercedes's patient instruction. "It took time, but they understand now." "Because you taught them," Mercedes said, looking at Maria with the kind of direct assessment Maria had learned to recognize in older Dominican women. "Elena's spirit came back to this house through your hands." The observation was both compliment and responsibility. Maria understood that Mercedes was acknowledging not just her practical contributions to the family, but her role as cultural bridge builder, keeper of traditions, and guardian of Elena's memory. As evening approached and the dining room filled with the aromas of Dominican cooking, Maria found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them all to this moment. 2 years ago, this house had been a mausoleum of wealth and grief, its inhabitants isolated by loss and unable to comfort each other. Now it pulsed with life, filled with music and laughter and the kind of cross-generational conversation that happened when people felt safe enough to be authentically themselves. The dinner table told the story of their evolution. Elena's good china was set alongside serving dishes Maria had brought from her own kitchen, formal crystal glasses beside hand-painted ceramics Mercedes had carried from Santiago. The centerpiece combined roses from Eleanor's garden with tropical flowers Jessica had found at the farmer's market, creating an arrangement that honored both Eleanor's sophisticated aesthetic and Elena's vibrant cultural heritage. When they finally sat down to eat, Richard raised his wine glass in a toast that captured everything Maria had watched happen over 2 years of patient, consistent care. To Elena, who taught us that love is a verb that requires daily practice. To Mercedes, who helped us understand that family extends beyond bloodlines and geography. And to Maria, who showed us that home isn't a place, it's what happens when people choose to take care of each other. The words settled into Maria's chest like warmth on a cold day. In 30 years of domestic work, she'd cared for countless families, had been appreciated by many, had even been fondly remembered by some. But she'd never before been publicly acknowledged as someone whose presence had fundamentally changed the people she worked with. Later that evening, as Mercedes told stories about Elena as a young woman in Santiago and Michael attempted to translate them into English. For Richard's benefit, Maria slipped away to Elena's garden. The roses were blooming in the October twilight, their fragrance mixing with the salt air rolling in from the Pacific. She knelt beside the bush she'd been tending when Richard first found her working after hours, the moment when everything began to shift between them. The plant had grown significantly over 2 years of consistent care, its blooms larger and more abundant now that someone paid attention to its needs. "I kept my promise," she said quietly to Elena, whose presence still felt strongest in this garden she'd created. "Your family knows who you really were now. They're proud of all parts of you." The fog began rolling in from the bay, as it did every evening, but Maria no longer needed to hurry to catch buses or worry about commute times. She had time to tend the garden, time to sit with memories, time to appreciate the view of a city that had finally become home, rather than simply a place where she worked. When she returned to the house, she found Richard waiting in the kitchen with a small wrapped box. 2-year anniversary gift, he said, seeming almost shy about the presentation. From all of us. Inside the box was a key, not the practical house keys she already carried, but something more symbolic. It was made of silver and engraved with words in both Spanish and English. Elena, Maria, Familia. "It's for the front door," Richard explained. "But more than that, it's our way of saying you don't work here anymore. You live here. You belong here. This is your home as much as it's ours." Maria held the key in her palm, feeling the weight of metal that represented security, belonging, and recognition she'd never expected to receive. From hired help to family member, from invisible to essential, from temporary employee to permanent part of something beautiful. "Thank you," she said, though the words felt inadequate for everything she meant by them. As the evening wound down and Mercedes told one last story about Elena's wedding to her first boyfriend in Santiago, a relationship that had ended when Elena chose education over early marriage, Maria understood that her own story was still being written. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to nurture the relationships she'd helped build. Mercedes would return to Santiago carrying stories about Elena's American family to share with cousins and aunts who'd never stopped loving the woman they called Elena even after she became Eleanor. Michael and Jessica would continue learning Spanish and planning their next trip to visit the Dominican family members they'd discovered. And Maria would continue being what she'd somehow become without planning or expecting it, the keeper of traditions, the bridge between worlds, the person who'd helped a broken family learn to love each other across cultures and grief, and the social expectations that had once seemed more important than authenticity. The fog rolled in from the Pacific, wrapping San Francisco in its nightly embrace, but the Brannigan house glowed with warmth that pushed back the darkness. Inside, a family that had learned to honor all parts of their heritage was learning to sleep soundly again, secure in the knowledge that someone who cared about them would be there in the morning. Maria climbed the stairs to her apartment carrying the silver key, understanding that she'd finally found what she'd been searching for without knowing it through 30 years of domestic work. Not just employment, but belonging. Not just appreciation, but recognition. Not just survival, but home. And you. Have you ever worked for someone who learned from you without saying it out loud? Have you ever been in a place where you felt invisible until someone finally chose to see you for who you really are? Tell me your story in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, if you recognized yourself in Maria's quiet strength, in Elena's struggle to exist between two worlds, or in Richard's journey from grief to gratitude, leave a like and subscribe so it reaches another woman who needs hope today. For more stories that honor the dignity of work, the power of persistence, and the beauty that emerges when people choose to care for each other across every difference that might divide them, click the podcast link. Thank you for walking this journey of the heart with us. In a world that often makes invisible the very people who hold families together, may we all learn to see, to appreciate, and to recognize that home is built not by those who own it, but by those who tend it with love. We'll see you in the next story, where ordinary people discover their extraordinary power to heal, transform, and create beauty in places that have forgotten what beauty looks like.